All right, friends, welcome back to our online Bible study in the book of Acts. And today we are looking at a masterpiece, a speech that a man named Stephen gives that is a simple masterpiece. I want to tell you why I think that's the case, and then we're going to look at what happens after he gives this speech. The last two times that we were together, I talked about boldness and fortitude. We talked about how those are things that God can give us, that as he renovates our hearts and our minds, that we can become increasingly bold and we can have an increased degree of fortitude. And we see in Stephen those two traits on display. And we see one of the very practical ways that God works those two things into our lives. So the speech itself is awesome. Learning more about Stephen, I hope, will inspire you, but it's also going to get pretty practical here at the end. So chapter 7, verses 1 through 53. Stephen starts this speech because the high priest is asked, "Are these things so?" Stephen then launches out into a speech that lasts about 50 verses. And based on what happens after the speech, you would think that the people listening were pretty upset about the content of the speech, but I actually don't think that's the case. If you go back to the end of the reading last time, you'll see that Stephen's face, it was like the face of an angel. They can see that God is doing something in his life. And then what he says in verses 1 through 50 are actually not all that controversial. If you're someone who needs to brush up on or has never had much experience with the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible before Jesus, this gives you an overview of a large part of the Old Testament, not all of it. But it'll tell you a lot about the history of Israel, the people of God, the Jews, before Jesus. So Stephen recounts this in a really, really wonderful way. And I think when he gets to the end of his speech, he hasn't really said anything controversial. I mean, he's under arrest. He knows that his life is at stake, but he hasn't really said anything to upset people in that speech. But then he adds this at the end. In verse 51, "You stiff-necked people, you're uncircumcised in heart and ears." That means that you are Jews, the people of God, by like the way that you were born. Like you were born into a Jewish family. The men have been circumcised. The women are faithful to the Jewish community. But he's saying you're uncircumcised, like inside, meaning you haven't had that heart change. Like you don't have the ears to hear. He's saying to them, people of God, he said, you're missing it. Which speaks to us. Like we're the kind of people who do Bible studies, you know what I mean? But we can still be missing it. You always resist the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit's doing something. God is up to something. Be careful. Even if you're a religious person, you can miss what God is doing right around you. As your fathers did, so did you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you've now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and didn't keep it. Now, there's a lot that we can do here, but here's the main thing that I want to point out in these few verses. Stephen knows this is going to get him in trouble. I mean, he knows that this will certainly keep him in prison and might even get him killed. Spoiler alert, next time, it does get him killed. He knows that. But in the face of certain persecution, he's still bold. He still has fortitude. How is that? Here's what I think that we need to see here. It helps us understand Stephen, helps us understand ourselves. Stephen tells this story not because they need to hear it. They all know this story. He tells this story, the story of everything that happened, not everything, but a lot of things that happened before Jesus, because he is reminding them that we're a part of this ongoing story. These aren't just stories about things that happened in the past, but it's just the beginning part of the story that we are still in. Don't miss this. Stephen sees himself as a part of this story. When we read Bible stories from the past, do we just see them as stories about what people did in the past, things that God did in the past? Or do we see that that's the history of the past portions of the story that we are still a part of? And when Stephen sees himself as a part of the larger story of what God is doing, well, it gives him boldness and it gives him fortitude because he knows that his life is not just about him. He is wrapped up in something way bigger than himself. When we see our little lives as just being about us, well, then the goal is to avoid any kind of suffering. The goal is to just build in as much pleasure into our life as possible. Stephen saw himself as a part of something bigger than himself. And when he did that, it led him to a place where he knew, even though this will lead to suffering for me, I'm going to be faithful to what God is doing. As Christians, we don't seek out martyrdom. He becomes the first Christian martyr. We don't seek that out. That's not faithful. But we do say that sometimes being faithful causes us to do things that we know will upset other people, causes us to do things that we know might actually lead to some degree of suffering in our lives. And that boldness and that fortitude is a gift from God, and it comes from the knowledge that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. Do you know that you're a part of a bigger story? Are you lost in thinking that your life is just about you? Do you know that you're a part of the grand story that God is telling, and that this chapter that we're in right now is the chapter that we get to be a part of? Reading this, being involved in this study, helps us to get our eyes there. So let's get out there. Let's keep with our reading, and let's look at how we can be a part of God's larger story in the big parts of our lives and in the little things that we're going to do today. God bless you, friends, and I'll see you next time.